Hey all, this is Mika. I'm back with another video. This one's going to be an updated war build tier list. I think the meta has kind of settled down at the moment, at least in NA. EU versus NA is supposed to happen within the next week, and we'll see how that develops. But for now, I would say this is fairly accurate in terms of what you should be playing. If you are trying to get into a war, I'd say Kill Squad, Bruisers, and Supports are generally the slots that are kind of up for debate. The other ones are tend to be more specialists. If you're a healer, it's also pretty easy to get in as a healer. Tanks are kind of hard to get into war slots with at the moment, but they're a role that's newer, so there's opportunities. Disruptors and peelers are usually people who have played Kill Squad for a while have found like a niche role that is really, really good there. And those slots are often kind of harder to get into as well. But with that being said, let's get right into it. Kill Squad, Bow Rapier seems to be the thing that has taken over the meta the most at the moment. It is able to defend the gates very, very well. It's able to push into the gates very, very well. It struggles a little bit in the clumpiness, like outside of fort, but that's like the main spot where Bow struggles, and even then, in that spot, it's really, really good. Firestaff Ice Gauntlet is kind of right behind Bow. Without Bile, it felt like Fire Stuff Ice Gauntlet was more patty in the past. With Bile and with the update, it feels like it's generally pretty strong still, even with the nerfs. It is able to put out a lot of damage. It struggles in a single target a little bit, but in general, for just bursting down clumps, it is very, very strong and is slotted a lot because of that. Greatsword Hatchet is like kind of the highest skill carry potential, like solo carry potential build in the game, I'd say right now. In OPR, it's very, very dominant. In War, it's a little bit less dominant, but the people who can make it work are the people that just take over War lobbies, basically single-handedly if they're not in check. It is run with a lot of strength and a lot of decks, and with very, very little con. Like I believe people are playing with 50 con right now, and in light, so it's a very much so a glass cannon, but if you are positionally aware and then you are aware when they're not looking at you, you could always be a threat, and then if they aren't paying attention to you, then you just go in, secure kill, and then kind of come back out. And that's where its biggest strength is. It's just able to destroy lobbies if it's not in check, and there's often times where if you're really, really good at knowing when there's weaknesses in the other team, like if you have a lot of experience, then it's like really you could see those opportunities and you could just take advantage of them with this build very, very effectively. Great Axe, Great Sword is also fairly popular. I would say it's less popular than those other builds, and it's more of a one of, and there's less people that play it, but it's still really, really good. The main strength of this is it's able to force out people's Sam. You can't really use the Great Sword to finish people as much now. It's kind of just a use your util and then kind of get out kind of vibe now. It's not insane overall, I'd say, but it's just generally good and was strong before and is still strong now. Firestaff BB is also a fairly strong kill squad build. It's able to blow up points very effectively. The main thing it struggles with is it just doesn't have the IG, and IG tends to just do so much. With the IG nerf, it will be interesting if this build gets any more popular, but for now, I'd say it's still niche and not played a lot. And then lastly, honorable mention Musket. It's not really played anymore, except when people were like experimenting with it. Did not really seem to do well enough to be slotted. You either suffer from accuracy problems or you suffer from damage problems with it, and there's no way getting around it. So for now, I'd say it's more of a lab build slash fun build and not serious for a war. The only thing that seems promising about Musket right now is the Trapper tree, and at that point, if you're running Musket for Trapper, there's just probably better builds. But it is pretty good at controlling the staircase in fort for what it's worth. Bruisers, I'd say heavy Great Axe Warhammer's the strongest type of bruiser right now, but it's the one that's the least slotted, if that makes sense. This is just due to the Fortify changes and due to how bruisers have just more passive Fortify. Along with the Fortify change, just makes it that a build so much more tanky. Bruisers in general right now are just gonna their main source of kills are detonate pushes, and I don't think it really matters what class you are between heavy or medium for detonate pushes. You're gonna do pretty similar damage, so I don't think that matters as much. And I think from that perspective, Great Axe Warhammer's able to do the job of controlling space a little bit better than the medium variant, and blow up clumps almost as effectively. That being said, medium Great Axe Warhammer is still very, very good, and it's the one that is mostly slotted for around the point groups because it plays as a pseudo disruptor role, and disruptors tend to want to be medium for the dodges. Medium Great Axe Warhammer is still very, very strong. I'd say the other interesting thing about Great Axe Warhammer builds in general now is people have been main-handing the Warhammer a lot more and off-handing the Great Axe a lot more, which is kind of interesting. Maelstrom axes seem almost mandatory in armor is okay, but the weakened effect is just so strong at keeping you alive that it feels very, very hard to cut. And if you aren't running that, there are a lot of people who just won't slot a Great Axe Warhammer if they don't have a Maelstrom piece in their axe or on armor right now. Some people are really, really picky about it, and they're like, hey, you can't play on point unless you have it in your axe. So even something like a 2-perk axe, and then you on your armor you have Abyss Warhammer, that's like perfectly acceptable because people have been main-hamming Warhammer to get around people trying to do some shenanigans with slash resist, and then when you do that, Warhammer ends up pumping basically as much damage. You have a little bit more CC. Plague Strikes on Warhammer goes crazy, and people have been really, really taking advantage of Warhammer to just kind of destroy like point teams altogether, both in NA and in EU. Medium Great Axe Blunderbuss, I'd say, is also kind of a lab build. Not super prevalent. People thought it would be good in light too at one point. Seen it in OPR a few times. Doesn't seem as strong as people thought it would be. Great Axe Ice Gauntlet is also up there as like a seemed interesting but never caught on. I think Void Gauntlet might be something that people start trying because Ice Gauntlet feels significantly weaker with the Entomb change. It feels like a lot harder to get out of Entomb with full stam, and if you can't recover all your stam in Entomb, then the value of Entomb just goes down drastically. In terms of supports, heavy IGVG feels the strongest to me. I think medium is very, very close. A lot of people have been running medium since like 250, 300 con. At that point, I feel like you might as well just go heavy because you're just band-aiding the fact that medium doesn't do a ton right now other than pump into the clumps and kind of more or less just pads the whole time. But I think both builds are viable in terms of medium and heavy. One thing to be wary of is when people have been increasing the con, it feels like more and more people are trying to get rid of the 50 focus aspect of VG and then trying to move it all back to int because the int stuff tends to scale better with the IG and IG. IG's damage is like fairly significant. There aren't a ton of bonuses other than the 250 int that are kind of noteworthy. If you get to 250 int with Void Gauntlet, the Rens will last longer, which is why it is kind of important to get to that. And people have also been trying to get to 250 con just to help with survivability and medium, which is why I think heavy's a little bit better because at that point, you might as well just play for the Fortify that's passive on VG, and heavy just does that job a little bit better. That being said, if you're playing something like in their backline or you're in a contested situation, the medium dodge is very, very nice, and I think both those builds are very, very solid. Medium Blunderbuss Ice Gauntlet is also up there as a support. I have this both as a support and a peeler, depending on how you slot it. If you slot it with 200 con, I would say it's more of a support build. If you slot it with 150 con, it's more of a peeler, because the 150 con variant is able to pressure out people a lot better than the 200 con variant, but both are still pretty solid right now. Heavy Blunderbuss Ice Gauntlet, the util from it is kind of just worse than Bile in most circumstances. You're basically slotting a mini Bile ult as an individual build, and what people have been doing recently is they just slot a lot more Biles than they used to, and that just makes something like a heavy BBIG just seem a lot less good overall, I would say. That being said, I could see this build being popular in some niche circumstances just due to how strong Exhaustive Net Shot is. Medium Greatsword Void Gauntlet, something that EU has been experimenting with. I've tried it in NA, it felt pretty good. I wouldn't say it felt insane, it felt very patty. But it is able, the util from Greatsword is very underrated where it's able to pull people in and then you're able to lock them down with the VG, and I could see that being popular in some way, shape, or form, just people haven't exactly figured it out yet. It feels a lot more consistent than it used to, and I'm not exactly sure why, but that's a build to kind of look out for. But it's still in a lab overall. Light Ice Gauntlet IGVG is more of a. I'd say it's good in OPR, but it's more of a for fun build at the moment. People have been trying to figure out if there's a way to run IG with no Tomb because Tomb got nerfed and it doesn't feel as good. And this is one of those builds that people have been trying, where you run Pylon, Storm, and Shower, and you basically just have ultimate zone control in the spot. And it's fun to play for sure. I just wouldn't say it's insane overall. It's just more of a fun build that if you want to have some fun in OPR, I would throw it on. And you'll have a good time. In terms of disruptors, SNS is the meta disruptor weapon of choice. Main reason is you can block damage that is incoming. The aura is very, very strong for keeping you alive. It's able to actually pressure and get out very quickly with Leaping Strike. Leaping Strike seems very, very strong overall. Some people go for the aura that boosts your defense. Some people go for leadership. It kind of depends on the player. Some people run multiple SNSs in their disruptor-oriented group. They'll run one that kind of engages first, and they have the the aura that makes it so that you're more tanky. They run another SNS where it has the leadership, so it gives everyone that damage boost, and then they have a few other util builds that have been rotating in and out. And that's where SNS has been slotted a lot. It seems like the best build to kind of get in and get out in terms of a main hand, has decent damage as well as really, really good disruptor util with how many slows it has and how many staggers and stuns it has inherent to its kit. I could very easily see SNS getting a nerf soon just because to it being very strong in terms of a disruption oriented tool. Maybe that was how it's designed, but for now it feels kind of oppressive due to how many staggers are just inherent in the kit. That being said, SNS Greatsword seems to be the best one to me because you can get in and get out very, very easily. Get your stand back very, very easy with the Greatsword. If people aren't paying attention, you can go main hand it and go to town, but usually you're just on the SNS, and this is more of a engaged, kind of more defensive oriented build. SNS Spear is the more offensive variant that people have been kind of running with leadership a little bit more, I'd say. It seems very strong. The main thing it lacks is kind of a way to get out. Relentless Rush is just super, super good at getting out. Spear doesn't really have that, so it requires a bit more of a pocket and is a little bit harder to go solo in certain spots. SNS IG has also been up there as a pretty good thing. I think this is going to fall off with the Ice Gauntlet nerfs, but for now is still being slotted. It feels pretty good overall. The main idea was you go in Ice Gauntlet, you cleanse everything that's on you, you get your stand back from the tomb, and then you just go back into fray. That seems less consistent now, and I could very easily see this getting replaced with a different SNS variant, but SNS seems like the best main hand disruptor weapon as of right now. Greatsword Hatchet's also up here. It was very, very meta last meta. I'd say it's fallen off a lot. The slow on Rupture is still very good, but generally is less successful than other disruptor weapons just due to having less staggers. And with Greatsword, it's very, very hard to go for heavy attacks now consistently. And when you're going for light attacks with Greatsword at that point, SNS is just outclasses it. Perhaps Greatsword was over nerfed to an extent, but that's just how that is being handled right now, and it's not really viable as that medium disruptor build that it once was, or at least is a lot less viable than it once was. Especially with the hatchet nerfs as well, have made it very difficult to get value out of both those weapons since they're both heavily nerfed. Greatsword Warhammer is also kind of an experimental disruptor build where you use the Warhammer as a main hand, because people have been doing that with Bruiser, and then you have the Greatsword to get in and get out. It feels pretty good, I'd say, overall, but I'd still say it's a lab build as of right now. In terms of peeler builds, BBIG in medium I'd say is generally the best one. Main reason why you're in medium and not as light is because you're using this to zone into space and you're trying to control a certain spot, and medium just tends to do that a little bit better than light because it's more tanky. You also just actually get value out of the Fortify in your tree, unlike light, where light, I would say you want to generally avoid Fortify, it's just not worth it. Medium actually gets value out of that and has pretty good damage as well. Both these builds are very, very solid as peelers. They're both slotted with 5 or 6 slots per war, and I don't imagine that's going to change a ton. That being said, it is in the slot that tends to change a little bit. The VG slot tends to be pretty static. 2 bruisers in each group tends to be pretty static unless they have some big overhaul to how those classes work. I could see this slot changing for other things, purely because it's the only slot that is flexible to be changed. That being said, it's performing very well in its role, and I expect it to be slotted there for a long time. Light IGBB is another build that people have been experimenting with, I'd say, in OPR. It's not caught on yet, but with the Tomb Nerfs, people have been trying things, and this is one of those builds that people have been trying. In terms of tanks, heavy SNS VG, I'd say, is the best general tank. It's really good in the 1v1 versus an SNS. VG's util is kind of undeniable. The main thing it struggles from is if you really, really pressure it, you can die if you're not familiar with all the various SNS techs that are present. But if you're really good at the actual SNS itself, you should be fine just living with this combo alone. And if you are able to master it, I think it is the generally best variant to go for. SNS Ice Gauntlet is very, very survivable. I think it was the best one last patch for sure. Current patch, debating it a little bit. I'd still say it's probably the best variant in gate phase. If you are struggling, I would tend to go Ice Gauntlet, and that tends to fix problems. It's just very solid overall. Pylon's good for ult charge. Shower's good for controlling who goes in and out because people don't usually have great swords, so there's no way to really counter that in the gate. Versus on the outsides versus shower, great swords can just relentless through it, and it feels like it does nothing. So I'd say it's still a very good build, but a little bit less popular. Heavy SNS Greatsword. This is just more of a borderline disruptor role that some people have been running. because then you can get away with a heavy shield. You don't really have to worry about that weird losing armor because you have a shield mechanic with SNS. Does decent damage as both a tank and as a disruptor, depending on how you build it, and is weirdly able to chase people down even while in heavy. Some people have been running Great Axe SNS as a like a bruiser role too, and then that's been another thing that people have been running in a similar spot where it's able to disrupt, chase people down, along with Bloodlust, and then you're just really not able to escape that build at all. And this is one of those builds that's also in heavy, but you really can't escape it very easily for some reason, and it feels really, really solid. That being said, I wouldn't do this as a one of SNS, and typically the current meta, there is one SNS, but if there were like 2 or 3 SNSs, this would definitely be a build to look out for, and I think would be easily runnable in that situation. It just struggles a little bit as a solo SNS because you want to be generally more static as a solo SNS. People play around you. You're the one that the AoE healer Sacred goes on, and that's where everyone fights around. So if you're everywhere, it's harder to follow. SNS Warhammer feels like a bit of a meme build, bit more niche. Some people have been trying Warhammer up top as a healer for an offhand to knock people off with clear out, and that's been kind of interesting, but not really something I would try as an SNS personally in a war. In OPR, it's very fun though, and it's very easily to 1vx with this in OPR. Heavy SNS Flamethrower is another kind of fun build. I think it's people are thinking about trying it again, but I don't think it's like really something that's people are seriously considering. It's just something that's like annoying, and when stuff is annoying, it tends to be good. So this is like one of those builds that could just be good because it's annoying, kind of like Greatsword Hatchet, or it could just fall flat on its face. And for now, it seems like it's falling flat on its face, but it might creep back in the meta. SNS BB, I think, is more of a lab thing, not really what you want to run because if there's ice showers around you, BB just sucks. In terms of healer builds, Sacred Beacon Divine, I think, is generally what people are running for healers. Sacred Clap Divine is also pretty good. The Clap tends to prioritize roots first, which is why it's been kind of creeping up in terms of being meta, and is being run more and more because it kind of ignores that whole root aspect, even though roots aren't super powerful right now in the first place. Both those builds seem very, very good. They're the ones that are run the most. Sacred Beacon Clap as a AoE healer is also kind of run a lot for that same reason. You could strip the what's on you. Some people like the orb because that will reduce cooldowns from what I understand, but and give a healing boost, but both of them are generally good, and orb is no longer complete debuff with the change for certain classes, so it seems like overall these are pretty good builds to run. I'd say that the AoE healer wise, there's usually only one, and all the rest are group heals, so you kind of have to have that sacred, you have to have that single target, and that last slot is what people have been debating generally. Sacred, as in terms of double single target healers, I think this is run in EU still. I don't think it's really run in NA anymore. Point groups in NA, they just slot an AoE healer, and then they slot SNS, and then that takes care of the, hey, we keep dying problem. EU still does double single target, which I think works too, but then you have less people on point, and an SNS in a clump fight is just so good to win those. That being said, EU tends to not clump up as much, so maybe it is still a good build if you play around it right. In terms of ults and which ones are the most prevalent, Detonate is by far the most prevalent ult right now. People are debating running it on BG, they're debating running it on BB, they're running it on Bruisers. Everything is about Detonate pushes in terms of how you win clumps, how you win fights, how you win wars, and there's not really a way around that. Detonate is just the best ult in the game right now. Especially, that's mostly due to the Ren changes, where Ren doesn't affect you as much as it used to. So there's not really a downside, and there's only upsides with Detonate, it seems like. The main thing is Elemental Version, like, kind of soft counter Detonate. I would say, generally, you have high enough base damage where that isn't really the case, but I've talked about that in other videos and don't want to talk about that as much in this one. Bile is also very, very strong. Seems like it's meta for most builds, especially the ones that get above 250 int. I'd say there's about 6 to 8 biles per war now, and there used to be one. The reason why that's kind of come about is clumps are so close to being on the edge of dying all the time that bile just puts it over the top, and then fires that pad, turns into pressure, and everything starts dying. Seems like bile is just very good in that regard. Firestorm is a way to kind of soft counter a lot of these pushes because it gets rid of the smaller stacks, reduces burn damage if you use that one, or it gives you haste if you use that one. People tend to not use the damage one because Detonate just outclasses it damage wise, but Firestorm is still being run as like a 2 to 4 of in most rosters, and is very, very good for gate phase in particular, and is also very, very good in point flip scenarios. It's usually being run by IGBB, partially because IGBB doesn't have a lot of empower, so it's just good for that role before they go off with plague splitting grenades or something like that. And then partially because they're in a spot where it's really good because it passes through your whole team, and you generally want to buff your team with this ult more than you want to weaken the enemy with this ult. But by buffing your team, you usually aim in the direction of the enemy, and you usually end up getting both. Vines, I think, is still meta, but is very, very niche, if that makes sense. So it's kind of on the border. I put it more in the niche category. I'd say it generally doesn't feel good for the most part, but when it feels good, it feels really, really good, if that makes sense. Vines is something that can totally swing a fight in your favor, but you have to time it perfectly now because the root is so, so small. It feels like the root only lasts for like half a second, but if you time it right, it's just clump wiping. Stormform is I put niche on here for healers. It's meta, but for actual Bruiser players, it feels more niche. Detonate just outclasses it for the most part right now, and I don't see a reason for people to really use Stoneform at the moment, since Fortify is worth less than it was. Even in heavy, it seems like where you'd think Stoneform was good, you feel survivable enough with Detonate with some of the recent changes where I think Detonate still makes more sense. Cannon has been something that was slotted and Bile is kind of replaced but I'd say Cannon's still usable for particularly for bows. But for fire staff, it feels like the Bile naturally complements the clumpiness aspect of it. Cannon is more of a single target thing, and it tends to be a little bit better for single target weapons like the bow. Ascent will never be meta in New World if they don't buff it, and they haven't buffed it. So yeah, that's it for this one, guys. I have a this took a bit, but there are a lot of different builds that are being played right now. I'd say it's a fairly healthy meta in terms of variety. Everything tends to blow up at once, though, and everything is comboed to be used at once, which can be a little frightening. So there's a lot of kind of reading when the enemy is going to go in, baiting them in, living, and then counter crashing that goes on. And most of the stuff is oriented towards that direction in terms of being related to how you play as a team more than actual individual mechanics compared to other metas in the past. With that being said, I will see you guys in the next video.